Hello, I'm Ron Strickland. This webcast is one of a series in which I'm providing some comments and excerpts from lectures on topics from the courses I teach in literary and cultural studies. Here I'm going to discuss the opening passages of F. Scott Fitzgerald's novel, The Great Gatsby.
One of the most distinctive features of The Great Gatsby is the narrative voice that Fitzgerald develops for telling the story. You may recall that in John Dos Passos' The Big Money, which treats some similar themes to those treated in The Great Gatsby, Dos Passos resists giving the reader a reliable perspective from which to evaluate the relative merits of the different characters in the novel. In The Great Gatsby, Fitzgerald uses a first-person narrator, Nick Carraway, who in some ways seems to be superior to the characters that he describes, but tainted by his associations with the rich and decadent society of which he is a part. Let's consider an example of how Fitzgerald establishes Nick as a somewhat but not completely reliable character. Immediately on the first page, Fitzgerald begins with Nick's voice. Nick saying, "In my younger and more vulnerable years, my father gave me some advice that I've been turning over in my mind ever since. Whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, he told me, just remember that all the people in this world haven't had the advantages that you've had." As we'll see in the novel, this advice applies directly to understanding Gatsby's aspirations. It gives us some criterion by which to measure the difference between Gatsby and these people who have inherited their wealth. It also establishes Nick as someone who is a decent human being, not simply egotistical and arrogant and smug like so many of the rich people he associates with. But then on the second page, we have this view of Nick contradicted to some extent. At the end of the third paragraph of the novel, Nick winds up by saying, "Reserving judgment is a matter of infinite hope. I am still a little afraid of missing something if I forget that, as my father snobbishly suggested, and I snobbishly repeat, a sense of the fundamental decencies is parceled out unequally at birth." Well, this is kind of interesting to me, and it's one example of many of the somewhat critical and ethical ambivalence of Nick's character. Here's a diagram that illustrates, I hope, what I'm talking about. On the one hand, here in the horizontal axis, we have advantage, wealth, versus disadvantage, poverty. And in Nick's first statement about some people having more advantages than others, he seems to recognize the different advantages some people have at birth, and seems to have a generous, humane attitude toward the foibles or the weaknesses of people who don't have those advantages at birth. On the other hand, on the vertical axis, Nick, I think with some self-conscious irony perhaps, asserts that some people have more basic decency parceled out to them at birth. And so, on this scale, he seems to be a little bit smug himself. At any rate, he then goes on to continue this ambivalent description of himself. There's some kind of self-conscious irony. On page 3, he writes that his family have been prominent, well-to-do people in this middle western city for 3 generations. He says, "The Carraways are something of a clan, and we have a tradition that we're descended from the Dukes of Buccleuch. But the actual founder of my line was my grandfather's brother, who came here in '51, sent a substitute to the Civil War, and started the wholesale hardware business that my father carries on today." Nick goes on to say that he's never seen this great uncle, but he's supposed to look like him, with special reference, he says, to the rather hard-boiled painting that hangs in his father's office. So there's this kind of opposition between the nostalgic and no doubt bogus attribution of the ancestry of Nick's family and the more realistic and the more immediate provenance of the family that is coming from this great uncle who came to the Midwest just before the Civil War, who sent a substitute to the Civil War for himself, started a wholesale hardware business and got rich that way. Skipping over now to page 12, Nick, having installed himself on Long Island, is invited to come to dinner at the home of a second cousin, Daisy Buchanan, and her husband, Tom, and there he meets their friend, Jordan Baker. The picture we get of the conversation and interaction at the dinner party is of rich and indolent people saying witty but inconsequential things to each other, and it's a very trivial kind of an existence. This goes on, and finally Nick says to Daisy, "You make me feel uncivilized. Can't you talk about crops or something?" But this leads the conversation into a kind of an unexpected turn. Tom breaks out suddenly with the exclamation, "Civilization's going to pieces." He's been reading a book called The Rise of the Colored Empires by someone called Goddard, and he goes on to talk about the decline of the Nordic race in a very racist rant about what's going to happen to the white race. It'll be overwhelmed by all of the so-called colored races if white people don't stick together. And the other participants at the dinner party find this kind of embarrassing and don't take him too seriously. But it gives us an insight into Tom's personality and the attitudes that lie just below the surface of this elegant society that we were being shown. Tom's racist rant is interrupted by a telephone call, and then Daisy follows Tom into the house. Nick offers to continue a conversation with Jordan, but Jordan shushes him, and saying that she wants to hear what's going on, and then tells Nick about Tom's infidelity, about his mistress in New York. The marital infidelity, the immorality of this elegant, upper-class, rich society is revealed very early on. Soon, Daisy comes back, and she's talking to Nick about the birth of her daughter. At the top of page 17, she says, "I woke up out of the ether with an utterly abandoned feeling and asked the nurse right away if it was a boy or a girl. She told me it was a girl, so I turned my head away and wept. 'All right,' I said, 'I'm glad it's a girl, and I hope she'll be a fool. That's the best thing a girl can be in this world, a beautiful little fool.'" So Daisy introduces the subordinated status of women in this society, Daisy's unhappiness in her marriage, and the marital infidelity of Tom will be in some ways reflected and paralleled by the relationship of Tom and Myrtle Wilson later in the novel. By the relationship of Tom and Myrtle Wilson later in the novel. And the relationship of Tom and Myrtle Wilson structurally balances off against the relationship of Daisy and J. Gatsby, in that in each case we have a rich person and a poor person involved in a relationship. In all of this, Nick remains a sort of detached observer. Even though he's associated with the wealthy upper class, he's Daisy's second cousin, he's not so rich as Tom and Daisy are, and he's not married, and he's not exactly in a relationship, although there's a kind of a distant flirtation going on between Nick and Jordan in the novel. All of these things give him a kind of a distance perspective from which to evaluate the actions and the motives of the other characters in the novel.
With that, I'll conclude this webcast, but, as always, if you have questions or comments, please send me an email.